Okay, so this is the third video on reading the Shroud of Turin paper that I wrote. One that I should add now needs to be updated a little from some new papers that have come out. I'll talk about them briefly at the end. Though I haven't necessarily read all of them, so maybe I should read them before I make such a comment. So anyway, resuming where we were, I just went over in the last video as a quick recap all the stuff about the properties of not only the physical properties of the shroud, but of the image, and then showed that the painting hypothesis really doesn't stand up to scrutiny. There are obviously many other hypotheses, such as it being a medieval photograph, which again I find really hard to believe just in and of itself, because the concept wasn't around at that time. But I do think in my paper I linked to another paper that pretty much goes over each one of these, such as bleaching and all the others, burning, and debunks them. I do know of Colin Barry and his scorchograph theory, and I do have something to say about it, but I'm going to save it to the end. And I just would also like to give some respect to Colin in the sense that he's at least trying to go and figure things out. I appreciate that, but I think it doesn't, even if his scorchograph theory is right, it doesn't at all show it's a medieval relic, but that I will get to in an addendum video at the very end of all this. So, I have my water because my voice, as you can tell, is not at its peak, but let's begin. So, chemist Walter McCrone was born in Wilmington, Delaware, and received a bachelor's degree in chemistry and a PhD in organic chemistry from Cornell University. More specifically, he was a leading expert in the field of microscopy, the technical field of using microscopes to view samples and objects that cannot be seen with the unaided eye. More notoriously, McCrone is known as the lone scientist from Stirp who dissented from the rest of the group and was convinced that the Shroud of Turin was a painting, though it should be noted his own tests were done after the investigation in the 1970s. McCrone went on to publish non-peer-reviewed papers which claimed that he had found iron oxide, a frequent ingredient of ancient paint. This, coupled with the documents of Pierre d'Alcis, a 14th century Roman Catholic bishop, please don't make fun of my French, who claimed his predecessors Henri and Poitiers knew the forger, led McCrone to conclude that the shroud was a forgery. However, there are problems with both of McCrone's premises. Firstly, the d'Alcis memorandum is nothing more than a hearsay. When the bishop sent his memorandum to the Pope, again, excuse my French, Clement VII, there was nothing about the alleged forger, not his name or his method. Clement did ask Deschamps, the man who was displaying the shroud at the time, to label the shroud as a replica. However, he also told d'Alcis to stop fighting with those at Lyry or be excommunicated, giving the impression that he wasn't taking d'Alcis's complaints that seriously. The bishop's skepticism is understandable. When Deschamps was killed at the Battle of Poitiers, his then-widowed wife may have put the shroud on exposition with the hope of making a little money. The thought of how the shroud of Christ could wind up in the hands of such a family as this undoubtedly passed through d'Alcis's mind. Of course, knowing that Deschamps' lineage is part of the Knights Templar who had possession of the shroud after the sacking of Constantinople in 1204 AD would have made the situation a lot more believable. But that didn't come to pass. Next, the work of Walter McCrone. McCrone concluded from a variety of tests that the blood on the shroud was not blood at all, and that the image was made from red ochre. The first two tests he did were repetitions of those done in 1973 by the Italian Commission. While in each case McCrone got back the results which agreed with those in 1973, that it was not genuine blood on the shroud, this shouldn't surprise us as the initial tests were fundamentally flawed. The report states that the encrusted pigmentations did not pass into solution in the solvents, acids, and alkalis that were used. Chemist John Heller, who along with Alan Adler critiqued and debunked most of McCrone's work, explained that if you don't do the right tests in the right way, you can never get old blood into a solution. If it's not in the solution, you can't attain a positive test. This is because samples that are heavily denatured, meaning their structure has been modified due to heat, ultraviolet radiation, acid, etc., do not adequately solubilize. McCrone, however, used this as support for his claims, also applauding the flawed tests of 1973. Though he went on to perform the far more complicated phenolphthalein tests, one has to view this also with much skepticism, given his failure with the first two far easier procedures. Though he also obtained a negative result with both the Takayama and the Teichmann tests, both tests are so insensitive that a result of negative is hardly worth anything. McCrone went on to test the blood, stating that when sodium azide in an iodine solution is applied to blood, nitrogen gas bubble production indicates the presence of sulfur-containing amino acids, which blood has. Applying such a solution, he found little or no nitrogen gas to be released. However, he failed to obtain such nitrogen gas in his own control group, not to mention again that the blood on the shroud would be incredibly old and denatured, rendering his test practically useless. McCrone's conclusion that the blood to be artists' iron oxide particles was based on neither chemical testing nor physics-based testing, but consisted simply of looking through his microscope and seeing particles that seemed to have the appearance and crystalline characteristics of iron oxide. However, the problem with McCrone's conclusion is that he looked at the blood while it was on a mylar tape. To quote John Heller, mylar is optically active, and any red particle looks birefringent when the light has to pass through the tape and particle. Hence why McCrone concluded that the blood was iron oxide. McCrone even admitted to this in 1996. So while all this may act as evidence against McCrone's claims, is there any positive evidence that the blood in the shroud is genuine? I answer with a resounding yes. Chemists John Heller and Alan Adler performed many tests which confirmed the presence of real blood on the shroud. First was the spectrophotometer test, in which wavelengths are shined through a material in order to see which wavelengths get through with what intensities. The two were searching for the Soret band, which is superabsorbent at 410 nanometers due to porphyrin. Needless to say, the Soret band was indeed found, which indicated that the sample was a fully oxidized, denatured hemoglobin. However, because of the lack of fine structure, the results aren't as positive as one may hope. However, Heller ran the same test on other samples they had contained what may be blood as well as with a control group of bloody Spanish linen and obtained the same results. At a conference in 1980 on the shroud's chemistry, Adler and Heller were able to work with more samples. Upon looking at them through a Zeiss microscope, Adler said, "If that isn't blood, I'll eat this microscope." Performing a hydrazine and acid formic test on the samples, Heller and Adler found that the samples tested positive for blood. This conclusion was further supported with the finding of protein in the samples, indicative of blood. Tests with hydrazine on red dots found on the samples showed that it was blood and not iron oxide. This was because the red particles would dissolve, something that wouldn't happen if they were iron oxide since the latter has a very low solubility. Furthermore, the samples dissolved produced the typical hemochromogen color of hydrazine and blood. Adler and Heller would go on to do other tests, all of which were the samples tested positive for blood. Their work, unlike McCrone's, was peer-reviewed. However, as I am about to explain, bad science has run amok when it comes to the shroud, and the most notorious example is the carbon dating of the Shroud of Turin, which will be the subject of the next video. So this one's much shorter. I want to keep them more to under 10-minute length. But one other thing, and I'm doing this from memory, so it's not going to be accurate, but also the other reason why it's really unlikely that the blood is a paint of some kind is the fact that the way the blood flows anatomically was so anatomically accurate that it was an anatomical accuracy that wasn't really understood in the medieval era. Medieval depictions of blood flow were not anatomically accurate, especially to the remarkable, really perfect degree that the Shroud of Turin has it. This can be elaborated more on in the books and the sources and the bibliography that I hope to have. If I forgot to put it in the paper, I need to put it in. But just to say, it's the infuriating thing I think that happens a lot, especially with Walter McCrone's work, is that it gets quoted all the time as some sort of de facto contra-shroud proof that it's a relic. Especially you see skeptic Joe Nickel use McCrone a lot, especially when the ENEA tests came out and Joe Nickel gave this response. He essentially was quoting the Darcy's memorandum along with the work of Walter McCrone, showing that, yeah, of course the shroud's a fake. I've talked about this for a long time. On my blog, which is a rather silly blog.blogspot.com, I took his little thing and pointed out really briefly and quickly why he was wrong in every single area. I don't want to sound like I'm being too rebuking, but unfortunately, there's a sad parallel. One of the things I think people who are atheists or agnostics, or just, I guess, non-theist skeptics, I think is probably a better word, are good about is science. I remember when I was an atheist, it was, because it's the epistemology of today. I think there's philosophical problems with that, but that's for another time, and I don't want comments going on about that, but atheists are good with their science, and we've got to commend them on that, and unfortunately Christendom has always been, unfortunately, behind, which is sad because if you read something like David Bentley Hart's Atheist Delusions, which he doesn't That title sounds very polemical, but the book really, it's a great book, goes into describing really a lot of the pseudo-history that religion has now been built around, or rather, has built around religion. One of them is that Christianity has always been an impediment to science, and you always hear Galileo, etc., etc., and he goes and shows that these are not really historically accurate, and actual scholars of history know this. It's just the pop history that keeps repeating this, and that Christianity in many ways fostered modern science, particularly based upon its epistemologies in Western Christendom. But it's sad now then to see most Christians, a vast majority of at least the vocal Christians in this country, denouncing evolution when they don't even really understand it. We've all heard the crocoduck or the ape coming, or a man coming from an ape, but that's not how evolution works at all. But the sad parallel is that when it comes to the Shroud of Turin, it seems to be the reverse. There's a lot of non-theists or skeptics who keep going and flocking to McCrone and Nickel, thinking that, well, look at these guys showed it was a fake, therefore we're all done. What are we even talking about? When those guys, their science isn't even on point to begin with. It's a really sad parallel that hopefully should be fixed just for the sake of not having bad science and not being ignorant. The same way that a lot of skeptics will claim that to religious peoples, I think people who are skeptical of the Shroud need to at least look at the rebukes and the work against Walter McCrone and at all, because his work's not sound science. And at the end of the day, I mean, there's nothing really else to be said. So with that said, the next video will be on the carbon dating, and particularly all the issue that surrounded that, because that's the other really big go-to thing. So again, I thank you, comments, everything. I'm sorry if I sounded a little too rebuking, though I may have come off maybe more rebuking against Christians, to which I apologize either way. Thank you.